Good morning. I am Brooke Clement, the director of the Gerald R. Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and it is my pleasure to welcome you. Before we continue, can you please ensure that your cell phones are turned on silent or off? Today, we are so pleased to be opening our latest exhibit, Ford at 50, Decisions That Defined a Presidency, to our visitors. A lot of work went into this incredible exhibit by our supervisory curator, Morel Lukey, Deputy Director Joel Westfall, our museum and archival teams, and our amazing contractor support staff. We hope you find this exhibit as terrific as we do. And I want to also truly thank our wonderful partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, as well as all of you for your continued support of this library and museum. And we also have some great programming and additional exhibits coming in September, so please check out our new website, which is launching today at fordlibrarymuseum.gov to learn more. 50 years ago today, President Ford promised he would not let the American people down as he assumed office. And we'd like to think that he followed through on his word. And now it is my pleasure to turn this over to Gleaves and our panel of speakers.
I couldn't help but think, as I was watching the president on the screen there, how apt those words are today. And I couldn't help but notice that after the clip was finished, what did the audience do? We applauded. He's not here to receive the applause, but what does that tell you that he applauded, that we applauded? It tells you that leaders continue to lead even after they have died. How do they do that? They do it because of their character, an enduring integrity of character that stands as an example for posterity. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're here today. This, the day of all days. This is the day, the 50th anniversary, the likes of which, the celebration of which, in this building, in this community, we will not see again in our lifetimes. It's an amazing day because we're paying tribute to a man, to a couple, to include Betty Ford, to a community that brought him into this world embraced with the great values to be strong and resilient and to lead. So you came to the right place today at the right time. And our run of show is going to be, we're going to have 4 distinguished people, panelists coming up. We're going to have Mike Ford, the eldest son of the president, come up. We're going to have Steve Ford, the 3rd oldest son of the president, Mrs. Ford. We're going to have Carla Hills, the secretary in the administration of Housing and Urban Development. And we're going to have Albert Zapanta, who is the assistant secretary of the Interior. All of these people knew President and Mrs. Ford intimately. They're the real deal when they speak. But the run of show is we're going to have them come up here in just a moment. I'll ask a few questions. They have so many stories, I probably only have to ask one question, and then they'll be off to the races. And then after that, at about 11:59, we'll want to go to the lobby. And then from the lobby, make your way to the plaza, because we have bells tolling, the pealing of the bells around the city, to mark at 12:03 when President Ford raised his hand and took the oath of office. And then 2 minutes later, at 12:05, when he began what I think is one of the finest, he wouldn't want me to call it an inaugural address, he'd call it just a straight talk among fellow citizens. But that's a hell of an inaugural address, 8-minute inaugural address. It's one of the finest. It's one of the finest. If you listen to the words, I urge you, you heard about half of it, I urge you to go back and study it. Study it for our time today. Because he unapologetically refers to his faith. He unapologetically refers to defending truth. He talks about the integrity that is necessary for a republic to hold together. All the themes that we're talking about every day today. So I say, as I said last night, and I said earlier this week at several programs, Gerald Ford was the necessary man in the 1970s to lead our nation. But Gerald Ford is the indispensable statesman to lead our country today in the 2020s. So with that, I want to just tell you how much we appreciate your being here to share this great moment with us. And I also want to pay tribute to the people who brung us to the dance. First of all, we've got a lot of family members here. Please raise your hand if you're in the Ford family. You up there? We got a whole row of Fords. Give them a hand. We also have some trustees here and former trustees. Please raise your hand. Thank you so much for being here. We have our wonderful partner, of course, in the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, led by Brooke Clement. We also have a wonderful partner in the University of Michigan. We have Daniel Rivkin, who's representing Michigan here. Thank you so much for being here. And I think we have a couple of public servants, elected officials here too. So please raise your hand if you're a public official. And thank you for your public service because you're carrying on the Ford legacy. Well, with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to come forward now. And let's get our conversation started. Let's give them a hand. That's great. Thanks so much for being here. Okay. Thanks, Steve. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. You know, we have you all coming in from all over the place. We have Washington, D.C., and we have California, and we have North Carolina. And where'd you fly in from?
Dallas-Fort Worth.
Dallas-Fort Worth, that's right. And we also have some audience members who've come from Puerto Rico and Virginia and California and all over the place. I mean, think of that. People are coming from all over the Western Hemisphere to be here to help us celebrate. Celebrating a day, August 9th, 1974. That's a day that had a profound impact, it would turn out, on our country. So I'd like to ask you all personally, what were you doing on August 9th, 1974? How did that day change you? Carla, why don't you begin? Secretary Hills, please.
I'm trying to wind back to that date to recall, but on August 9th, 1974, I was serving as Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department. And I watched the ceremony and the speech that you were just hearing. And I was finding it a very emotional time.
Excuse me, Carl. Indication it's not working? Okay, let's make sure that's on. There we go.
Oh, that was my fault.
Now you can really rewind. You don't want to miss a word.
All right, let me say again that I do recall August 9th, 1974, and it was an emotional time for all of us. It was a traumatic time, and as I said yesterday, you know, some of the times then remind me of some of the times we are facing now, and we should listen very carefully to what the President just said in the video that you were shown. But I was serving as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Civil Division at the Department of Justice on that date. I watched the speech at the time and found it to be very emotional in terms of what our nation faced. I also had enormous admiration for the nonpartisan way in which the Vice President, just sworn in as President, took over at these uncertain, tumultuous times. And the Civil Division handled all of the complaints against departments and agencies. So if a secretary was sued, with some allegation, it came to the civil division. So we had been watching the Watergate circumstance unwind with great concern. And I can tell you that the admiration that I and my team held for the Vice President of the United States, then about to raise his hand on 12/03 to be sworn in as president, was something that we thought would benefit our nation.
Thank you, Gleeds. Well, I was a young fellow, 1973, 74, as a White House fellow. So I was able to watch Gerald R. Ford become vice president. And then during that term, and the same day that Carla and I stood in the East Room as a young fellow that was just completing my year, which was August of 74, and was also asked that same day that they would like me to stay on and to be part of Gerald R. Ford's presidency in the White House as an advance man. And I did. And so I was very, very proud to be asked at a time where I was there to really see the man, be the vice president and then president, and then was able to be with him on a few trips. One I'll highlight to you, and that is, and you'll remember when in Sacramento, California, that Squeaky Fromm pulled a .45 out to try to assassinate President Ford. That was my lead. I was there right behind him and Don Rumsfeld when that happened. And thank God for a fellow by the name of Boondorf, who was our Secret Service fellow, that knew how to not only disarm her, but also disarm the weapon so that it would not fire. And all I remember hearing was gun, and we took off running because we were going to go in, or the president was going to meet with Jerry Brown, the governor of California. And he walks in, and you know the kind of man he was. You would have never known that he had just had somebody try to assassinate him. He went in. Jerry Brown did not know it either because it was that quick. And when he came out, same president with the demeanor that he always portrayed. So that gives you one glimpse that I was able to see of a really great man that handled a very, very important time in our history that he survived because she was not successful. The second time was, and it brought me to think of those of you that wear the collar. I serve as a trustee of the University of Dallas, Catholic University in Irving, Texas. And I remember at another time that I was in a meeting with just the president, Dick Cheney, and our director of politics, Stu Spencer, who was my mentor from California. And the president had just stated the day before that he felt that, and he had met with the Pope and basically came away from that trip feeling very strong that Poland was not a communist country and that it maintained the spirituality of the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the press got all over him. And so in that interesting vignette, and myself being kind of like a fly on the wall, between the discussions with the president and Stu Spencer and Dick Cheney, they were trying to convince him that we're in an election. You can't say that. You have to deal with this. And he would, solid as a rock, he says, I believe that the people of Poland have maintained their spirituality, and I'm not going to change. Until Stu Spencer, not Dick Cheney, says to him, and forgive me, damn, Mr. President, we're in an election, you got to do something, and presidents are killing us. It took him 2 days, and he finally came out, and he handled it in such a way where he did not have to retract, but he did do what he had to do. So those are two vignettes that are very, very indelible in my time with him, along with some of the other times with him. So I'll stop with that.
Well, which of you wants to take on the question of how August 9th, 1974 changed you all?
I'll take that one. I'm going to start on August 8th. And that was the day that my wife, Gail, we had been married a month. We were driving up to Boston, Massachusetts to start graduate school. Both of us were starting. And we had the U-Haul and everything. And so there was no cell phone. There was no, communication, except for the radio. And we get all the way past New York, and we find out that, that President Nixon is going to resign. And so we immediately pull over, call our family, and it's confirmed that we need to get back to Washington, D.C. quickly. We finished our trip, left the U-Haul to Gail's parents and some friends to unload. And then we jumped on a plane early that Friday morning, the 9th, from Boston to Washington. And we brought with us the family Bible. We have a Jerusalem Bible, and we wanted that, or Dad and Mom wanted that to be at the swearing in. And so we brought that with us, and, as a family, we met right before the swearing in, and we had the Bible open to his kind of life, his life passage, which his grandmother, Dorothy Ford, had instilled into his life, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And that was where he wanted to put his hand as he took the oath of office. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And that was his pledge to God and to our country, and then you saw his remarks. But that was a frantic time for Gail and I, but it was a beautiful time as well as for our family.
I think I was, like the rest of our family, shocked how quick it happened. The gravity of it being a constitutional crisis, and you heard it in Dad's speech, that this was a man who's going to become president of the United States without going through a general election. And it never happened in the 200 years of our history. I was, like Mike and my brother Jack and Susan, we were all just praying for Dad and Mom. This happened just so quick. Most families that end up in the White House go through a year or two of campaigning and preparation, and we literally had no time, barely time to comb your hair before you were going to be catapulted into the White House. But it wasn't about us. It was about supporting Mom and Dad. And I'm listening to his talk. Truth is the glue that holds us together. And he trusted the process. He trusted his people in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. And I hope we can get back there, because that is not, truth is not valued today. That's not a shock to anybody. That's truth. It is not valued today. And I think of the campaign that Dad ran against Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter ran against my father. And it was tough. It was rough and tumble, but it was truthful. And the campaigns we see today, I hate to tell you, I'm ashamed. Mm-hmm. And that was 50 years ago, and we got to get back there. We've got to get back to some bipartisanship where Democrats and Republicans and independents can work together and rally around truth. That's what shocked me about his speech. Yeah, we need truth again to save this republic. And it's going to start with you, the people out there, because our leaders are not proceeding that way and not acting that way. And that's how it touched, hearing that speech again touched me like that. So we need to swing back the other way.
We're going to hear a lot about Gerald Ford's achievements. Yeah. We're going to hear a lot of the details of Gerald Ford's biography, his achievements. You know, this museum is a living tribute to that. But I do want to get at what made him tick. What was inside him that made him a successful president?
Yeah, I'll lead off. I think the things that stand out to me, one has been said several times already, was his character as a man and as a leader, the integrity in his life, not a perfect life. He had his flaws, but he was able to acknowledge them and work on them. But people knew that he was a man of his word, and you could trust him. And that was so important and for his presidency, is because it was such a contrast to the former president. The second thing was, I think, his experience and his competency as a legislator, as a leader in Congress, the 25 years in which he worked on Capitol Hill with Republicans and Democrats, you know, kind of shaping the legislation and moving the country forward in his role as minority leader of the House. He had these relationships with, like, Tip O'Neill and others on the other side, where they could come to agreement and common ground and make things work in our government. And he had that experience and competency as, you know, taking the office of executive, you know, leader of the country. And then finally, I think he was good at good judgment in picking a team, like Secretary Hill's, General Zapanta, others who were part of his administration. It was a good judge of people who had skills and talents and you know, a desire to serve their country. And so he surrounded himself with, I think, outstanding administrators and cabinet members, and that he relied on them because he just couldn't do it all himself. So those were three things that really contributed to his, you know, effectiveness in a very, very difficult time.
I would add to Mike that Dad told me many times that a president can only be as good as the people he surrounds himself with. He can't edit and take in all the information and vet it out. He has to trust the information that's coming back to him from people he's chosen. I think Carla and them would agree with that. So that team that he was surrounded with was so important. And the other thing Dad always talked about was, and Carla, I think you'll agree with this, he wanted to hear every side of an issue in a meeting. He didn't want to just get tunnel vision about something. He needed to hear both sides of an issue and give it a fair hearing. And that's important, that we don't get caught in political ideology, that we just get on one track. It's for the good of the country. And so I would add that to what Mike said. And Carla, did he want different views on every subject that came up before him?
I would totally endorse what both of you have said. Mike and Steve are so correct. he had the capacity to listen and wanted to hear the other side of the table. You already saw that when he was elected minority leader and he was leading the Republicans, but negotiating with those Democrats that had the majority position. And when he came in as president, he would hold small meetings as well as entire cabinet meetings. And he wanted to know when there was a debate. He had the capacity to listen. And he used to say, the important things that I believe in is that you should communicate. And then you should be willing to conciliate if there are differences. Cooperate, but be willing to compromise. Those were his so-called 4 C's. But I think and recall a number of meetings that we had on housing issues, community development issues, primarily because of the very high inflation. Every federal program costs money. And there was a division between those that were responsible for the budget, that wanted to cut it clean, and those that were trying to administrate programs that are public needed in these times of great duress and economic turmoil. And he would listen and then find the right path through. Yesterday I mentioned the emergency housing bill for 1975, but that list goes on, and I remember that so well. We could all take a lesson from that to listen and communicate and be willing to compromise.
I'll take it to kind of the end of my time working with the president during the White House period of time and the campaign. We were driving in California to a meeting in Pomona, and I was with him in the back seat, just the two of us, and we passed an area where I grew up and my father grew up in East Los Angeles. And I says, you know, Mr. President, I grew up right up there on that hill, as also with my father, was born and raised there. And he said, well, tell me about your family, Al. And so I said, well, the highlight, I had a mentor in my father who was the first Hispanic Mexican American to go to the University of Southern California in 1935 on a football and track scholarship. And that's all I had to say, football. Okay. He went on, he said, well, tell me. And then I said, well, Mr. President, he played in the 1939 Rose Bowl against Duke, and USC, we won. He said, Al, I always wanted to play in the Rose Bowl. So that's a side of him, that he could change, but yet be who he really was. And so within about 3 months, I got a phone call from Dick Cheney, who was then our White House chief of staff to the president. So the president wants to see you. So he did something that is indelible to me, and it tells you who I am and where I've come all these 50 years because of him. My father, Gerald R. Ford. And what he did, 200 years, it was the bicentennial, 1976, nobody with my ethnicity had ever been a cabinet officer. And he decided that he wanted to make me the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, which I was fortunate enough to be selected and pass the Senate. So that tells you the other side of how he also thought of the future. So I will always carry that with me. Thank you.
Wonderful story.
Gleaves, we're talking about last night about how West Michigan invested in Dad's life growing up, particularly some strong people in his life, his mother, his stepfather, who took him under his wing, some of the teachers and coaches and high school principals. But the story I told last night, and I was thinking about it after we had our session last night, about how his mother you know, had a violent husband, originally Dad's biological father, Leslie King, who struck and beat his wife, Dad's mom, Dorothy, and she fled with Dad as a baby. And she was that strong presence in his life, and he ends up in Grand Rapids, and all these people invest in his life. But I saw some pictures in the exhibit you're going to go up to tonight, or this morning, of the Operation Baby Lift, of Dad coming off the plane with these little babies that showed his compassion for humanity. And I think it goes back to Dorothy. I think it goes back to that abusive relationship that he had such a heart. What he grew up in as a child, being abandoned by his father, and the violence, the love by his stepfather, the investment by Grandpa Ford. But when Operation Baby, you know, they were getting out of Vietnam, and Congress, you all would confirm this, Congress did not want to spend another dollar to get the troops home from Vietnam. It was over. And Dad said, we have to go back and help these people that helped us. They were our friends. And Congress said no. Dad went up there and basically begged for money to have, you know, people come out of Vietnam that worked for us. They were going to be killed by the North Vietnamese as they came down. And this Operation Baby Lift happened, and they evacuated thousands of these orphan babies, many of them fathered by American servicemen. They were going to be abandoned. And I think Dad's history of his father and all that played a role in Dad. And there were people that stepped up privately to fund that Operation Baby Lift. One man, I think I read in Richard Norton Smith's book, mortgaged his house to lease a big plane to fly hundreds of babies home from Vietnam. That was the commitment, the humanity of these people, and Dad kind of led that charge, and he made sure that all those the most people, the refugees that came out of Vietnam, he made sure as president the most came here to Grand Rapids. That was, you know, if we're going to do it, I'm going to make sure I do it for Grand Rapids more than anybody else. And so that's a great history, I think, goes back to his mother and his experience just as a human being. Yeah.
We had lost the war, but we were going to win the peace by our moral example to the world.
Yeah.
Well, this kind of elides into my next question, and probably the last question before we open it up to the audience. But, you know, he had this inner strength. He had inner resources. So when you look at his life, what was the most difficult decision he made? What was his darkest hour from your point of view? And how did he get through it and be resilient to keep getting up and doing what he had to do?
Carla, you were on the front lines. What do you think?
I think that the whole process was extremely challenging, and he was enormously criticized when he pardoned Nixon, but he felt it was the right thing to do. And if there ever was a person that I've ever met who was so guided by the notion of doing the right thing, but he was accused wrongly of giving the pardon so he could be elevated from vice president to president. He often said, I never aspired to be president. I always wanted to be Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
And he loved the House of Representatives, and frankly, both parties thought very highly of him. But the most challenging time, and I think really an emotional time for him, was to pardon. The facts were that there had been a wrong. They did not know how much the former President Nixon had participated, but he wanted to do the right thing. I think he did. And then he continued to do that in his time of office, always searching for the bright star that led him, whether it was in international dealing with the refugees, whether it was the lowest quintile of our population that he cared about, whether it was discrimination. You've heard the story that even as a young man at the University of Michigan, a superstar in the football game that was challenged by Georgia Tech, they would not field the game, Georgia Tech said, unless they, if Michigan had a black player on the field. And Jerry Ford, good friend, roommate when they traveled, Willis Ward, was a black American. And so he said, I won't play. And it was only after Willis Ward insisted that he play so they could beat Georgia Tech that he went on the field, and by golly, they did win. And I think that winning was what he got out of always being in the cabinet of wanting to be the guy that did the right thing.
I'm going to give a quick video. I had mentioned I was an advance man during the first 6 months of President Ford's presidency. And it was midnight on a Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. And I was there with somebody that, Joe, you'll remember, was a member of our foundation, Terry O'Donnell. And I were there getting ready because we were going to be moving the president on a trip. And it was about midnight, and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney came in, and we were right outside the Oval Office where we would work in the little cubicle. And he said, the president's still in? Yeah. So they went in, and about, I guess, 30 minutes later, they leave. They don't say a word to us, so we just continue to work. And about a half hour later, the president came out. And I remember so vividly his face and how you could sense there was a very weighing feeling about what he was about to do. I didn't know he was going to do it. What he said was, he says, I just talked to the president's daughter, and she doesn't feel that he can make it much longer. And he walked away. And so I will go to the end of my time always believing there was a side of President Ford that gave that pardon, was the humanist side of him, that both his sons, and we know, and they can tell you, because at the end of the day, yes, he understood what was going on politically. Yes, he understood a lot of the other things that would the impact, but he also knew it could cost him his election.
And it did.
And he stood up for it, and I'll always remember that moment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my colleagues have expressed it well. I do feel like there were many decisions that weighed heavy on my dad's heart and mind. And I do think the Operation Baby Lift, just our evacuation, the chaos of that, where Saigon had fallen and things were just just very, very difficult in Vietnam, that was heavy on his heart, and he did everything he could to get more funds and more support to bring our friends from South Vietnam out of the country. And it was not only those orphans, but 130,000 refugees were rescued and brought back and resettled here in the United States. And it was a beautiful act of grace and determination. So I think that's high on the list, as well as the pardon was a very difficult and hard decision that weighed heavily on him too. But as I think in all those cases, he did what he felt was the right thing and used not only his judgment but his compassion, and I'm so grateful for that.
Gosh, Cleves, I'm not. They've said it all. The one thing I would throw out there is I'm trying to put myself in Dad's shoes. Within weeks of him becoming president, wrestling with all these things, the Vietnam War, the pardon, and Nixon and everything, all of a sudden, my mother comes home from a doctor's appointment, diagnosed with breast cancer and going to have a mastectomy. And I'm trying to think of myself as a husband. The weight of the world is on your shoulders about all these issues, and your wife comes home with breast cancer and what that would feel like. And I'll never forget how proud I was of my parents that, back then, breast cancer, women didn't talk about it. That was a closet disease. You could not literally say breast on TV, and the shame of that for women. And there was talk in the White House of just, Betty could step back and go away and nobody talks about it. But my mom and dad decided that they were going to try to take the shame off of that disease and be, again, transparent, open, truthful. And I'll never forget my parents talking about that and letting the public know that Mom had breast cancer. And for him as a husband to be doing all he did, supporting her plus trying to run the country. But all the calls and letters they got, first of all, the letters that came in to Mom, a lot of them were shameful in that they couldn't believe she talked about it. Like, you should have never said anything. And once that was heard, 10 times the letters came in from women who said, thank you to the First Lady for trying to take the shame off this disease. And the letters I loved, and I'll close with this, are the letters that Dad got that said, thank you, Mr. President, for showing me how to stand next to my wife. Mm-hmm. And that's a leader of our family that I miss. He was a great dad and a great husband, so yeah.
Oh, what a story of resilience, of bouncing back in a way with such aplomb and grace. Wow, all four of you, thank you.
Well done. Well done.
Our time is tight, so we only are going to have room for one question, I'm afraid. But yes, sir.
I'd like to ask the panel, what award should what honor that has not been given to President Ford, in your opinion, should be given to him? Congressional medal, gold medal, Presidential Medal of Freedom? What award?
Dad was he was not one that did things to get awards, and he was very comfortable in his own skin. I would leave that up to others. He was very comfortable with his record, and he'll let it stand. And if I say whether you like his politics or don't, I can tell you he was a great father, and that's the award I would give him. So yeah.
I think the award that meant the most to my dad was the Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy Foundation with, Ted Kennedy, and because that was, it really validated the fact that many people jumped on him for pardoning Nixon. They felt it was some kind of deal, and Nixon should have gotten more under the legal process. But he knew that was the best decision for the country and for, bringing back our country from the crisis and also healing the land. And the Kennedy Award really was for Ted Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy, as they presented that, was saying, you put your political future, your ahead. You put the country ahead of your political well-being. Yes.
One of the things, might it help restore a sense of bipartisanship in Washington if Democrats and Republicans could honor your father?
Yeah, I think if
Can
they
you
could
hear
look
him?
to my father and the way in which he served our nation across, partisan politics, and see that as a example and model for doing good government and respectful civil democracy, which we need desperately, I think, to raise that, that record and that legacy would be really helpful to our country right now. Yeah.
Well, thanks. I want to thank all four of you for giving us such keen insight into the inner man, Gerald R. Ford, as well as highlighting some of his accomplishments, his achievements, his character that we saw. But you gave us sort of that inside view that I really appreciate and that will stay with us the next 895 days. That was the length of his administration. And for 895 days, we're going to celebrate this amazing couple, Gerald Ford, Betty Ford, and stay tuned to our programs. Come back to the museum here often, go to the library in Ann Arbor often. Get to know these amazing people better, because the more we can talk about them to the broader public, the better our country will be. Thank you for being here.
You ever get that